you so much, John. Thank you for that kind introduction. And yes, I'm happy to tell you a little bit about both of the two things that you sort of queued up for me, and then we can move into our discussion for this morning. So as John mentioned, a lot of my work focuses on US and Soviet cooperation for non-proliferation. And as I'll try to highlight in my remarks over the next 50 minutes or so that we have together, that really came to the fore and played an important role in the negotiation and the conclusion and the subsequent entry into force of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So contrary to what we see today, the United States and Soviet Union did often cooperate really closely in the non-proliferation context. And one of the fruits of that labor was the NPT. So that's sort of the nexus of my work, I would say, as it relates to both sort of area studies focused things, but then also the non-proliferation regime writ large. So even though I'll try to keep our talk this morning focused mostly on the NPT, you'll see my true sort of scholarly colors shining through at various moments. And as John mentioned, another focus of my work that I think we'll also pull in this morning relates to this issue of sort of gender diversity and gender equity in our field. And you know, it will come as no surprise to many of the women, but everybody on the line that there is a gender imbalance in our field. So we tend to have more men working than women. And so part of what I have tried to do, just kind of based on my own experience as an undergraduate, is to get younger women interested in our field and to help them understand where their skills and interests apply to our space so that they can hopefully start to think about career paths and learn more about the types of careers that could be available to them as they think about what's going to be next after they graduate. So Jean has actually been a really wonderful mentor in our program to some of the undergraduate women. But if any of you are interested in sort of talking further about that, since I think, you know, this idea of kind of diversity and equity in our field is one that's really important and one that I'll also talk about a little bit today. I'm more than happy to do that. So please know that I am available to do that. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So bear with me for just 1 second here while I pull my slides up. All right. Okay. I hope everyone can see that. Okay. Yeah, it looks like so. Okay. So as Jean indicated, this morning we're going to be talking about the NPT, and this is a very long title because we have a lot to cover, but we'll be covering the history and provisions, the review process, and the role of the NPT in the global non-proliferation and disarmament regime. And I want to keep our discussion sort of on track because we don't have a ton of time together and we can really delve into some of the big questions during our next panel session. But what I do want to be sure to cover is the NPT itself. You know, what are its terms? What are its provisions? How was it negotiated? So as I sort of alluded to in my introductory remarks, it's the product of cooperation between the United States, the Soviet Union, and in fact, the United Kingdom. How is it reviewed? How do we understand, you know, whether its provisions are actually being implemented and carried out? How do we evaluate that? How do states parties understand that? And then also to talk a little bit about what's next, because as I'm sure you have sort of gleaned over the course of your time in the summer session, but also in your own work, the review process is a little bit out of sync with the way that it usually is as a result of the pandemic. You know, what isn't? And so I think it's interesting to contemplate a little bit what might happen next, and then we can delve into that more during our next interactive Q&A session after this. So just in terms of the very basics, you know, the basics of the NPT itself, it has 11 articles, 10 of which are substantive. And when you hear people talk about the NPT, they often talk about sort of three pillars. So you have the non-proliferation pillar, which is the pillar that says, you know, countries that do not have nuclear weapons aren't going to acquire them. You have the disarmament pillar that says parties that do have nuclear weapons are going to commit to engage in good faith negotiations to get rid of those nuclear weapons. And then you also have the peaceful uses pillar, which sort of sits in the middle of those two things. And the peaceful uses pillar is essentially what gives states parties the inalienable right to develop the peaceful uses of nuclear energy and to make use of those. And so those are kind of, you know, you can sort of think about the NPT as a pediment that rests on these three mutually reinforcing pillars. And one of the things that's important to know about the treaty, and that is sort of a reflection of the time in which it was negotiated, is that it distinguishes, as I'm sure you know, between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. And the nuclear weapon states are those that have tested before January 1st of 1967. So as we'll see in our coming slides, the NPT was really negotiated during the 1960s. It was concluded in 1968. And so that's part of why you see this specific date as the one that defines the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. It's also one of the, it's important to know that as you're thinking about, how might one go about universalizing the NPT. So the NPT has a lot of states parties, 190, but it doesn't have some of the key nuclear weapon states that exist in the world today. It has 5 nuclear weapon states who are party to it. So when you think about challenges like how could we potentially get, India and Pakistan maybe to join the NPT? What about Israel? What about North Korea? That would really require those states to disarm and to join the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states. There is not a mechanism for them to join as nuclear weapon states. So that's one of the things that, we can discuss that in Q&A if you'd like to, some ideas for what that might look like to encourage those states to join, but you can see that there are some challenges to universalizing the NPT because of that provision. And one of the things that I think makes the NPT a little bit unusual when you look at it in comparison to some of the other treaties that comprise the non-proliferation or disarmament regime is the fact that the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states have different obligations. So if you look, for example, at the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that's not really true. If you look, for example, at the CTBT, that's not really true. The NPT is a little bit unusual in that respect. And even though the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states both under Article 6 of the treaty, as we'll see, are committed to engaging in good faith negotiations leading to disarmament and in sort of in the context of general and complete disarmament, we often think about those disarmament provisions applying more specifically to the nuclear weapon states themselves. And so you see a little bit of a articulation of the ways that these different obligations manifest in some of the review documents that have come out of the NPT review process. And we can talk about what that looks like as well. Okay, so I talked just a moment ago about the fact that the treaty rests on these 3 pillars. And the other metaphor that people often will use to talk about the NPT is this idea that it is a grand bargain. And so this kind of gets to what I was referring to a moment ago with these different provisions for the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. So under the first 2 articles of the treaty, you have the nuclear weapon states committing not to transfer nuclear weapons to non-nuclear weapon states. So if you have nuclear weapons, if you're the United States or Russia, you are committing, for example, you're committing not to transfer nuclear weapons to countries that don't have them. That's really the core sort of non-proliferation provision of the treaty. And then the flip side of that coin is that under Article 2, the non-nuclear weapon states are committing not to acquire nuclear weapons. So to the extent that we think about the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-proliferation treaty rather than a disarmament treaty, I think that is really sort of the core nugget of where you see those obligations coming through is in these non-transfer provisions that make up the first 2 articles of the treaty. And in conjunction with Article 2, you also have non-nuclear weapon states committing to accept IAEA safeguards in exchange for access to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So that really gets us into Articles 3 and 4 of the NPT. The IAEA safeguards, I'm sure you've talked about that in the context of your course, but those are the safeguards that ensure that if you have, peaceful nuclear facilities, equipment, material on your territory, you're not diverting those to military or unauthorized uses, anything like that. The IAEA makes sure that that is not happening. And what you get in exchange for accepting these sort of limitations on your nuclear program is access to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. That's one of the inalienable rights that's enshrined in the NPT itself. And so that's kind of, when you hear people talking about what is the grand bargain, that's often sort of what they mean, but sometimes they also mean this balancing act between the provisions of the non-nuclear weapon states not to accept nuclear weapons and the obligations of the nuclear weapon states who are committing under Article 6 to pursue these good faith negotiations on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race, to nuclear disarmament, and to general and complete disarmament. So you have both of these different groups accepting these different obligations, and that comprises also part of this grand bargain that's at the core of the NPT. And so I'll just draw your attention here to a couple of things that I think are important about Article 6 here, which is the disarmament provision of the treaty. First of all, I want to highlight this phrase, good faith negotiations. We can have a conversation about what we think that actually looks like, what that means, but that is what states parties are obligated to do under Article 6. And so when we get to the end of the presentation, and hopefully we can have plenty of time for questions because I'm curious to hear what you guys think, I'd be interested to hear what you think good faith negotiations look like. What does that mean? Does that mean states parties need to be engaged in a treaty negotiation? Does it mean that they need to be having strategic stability talks? What does that actually look like? That's a big question, and that's the kind of question that states parties look at in reviewing progress towards the implementation of the treaty. I also want to point out, again, some of these kind of manifestations of the moment in which the treaty was negotiated, but ones that are also relevant for us today. So you'll notice here that these negotiations are supposed to be aimed at concluding effective measures relating to the cessation of the arms race. When you think about a treaty that was negotiated in the 1960s, that seems like something that would be really, really important. And sort of interestingly enough, if we think about, this cliche that history repeats itself, which I think there is some truth to, it's also interesting to think about what are the present circumstances today that we're facing. Are we on the brink of a new arms race? Have we already begun to engage in a new arms race? And how does that influence what we understand to be the objective of these good faith negotiations that states parties are supposed to engage in under Article 6 of the treaty? You'll also often notice that you'll hear people talking about and sort of discussing whether nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament need to happen together. And there's this important comma between these two subordinate clauses here in this sentence. And so there are different perspectives about whether nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament need to be happening all at the same time, whether nuclear disarmament happens first and then you have general and complete disarmament, or how those two things fit together. And so again, I'd be curious to hear sort of what you think, and using your own judgment based on your own experience, whether you think that nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament have to go together, or whether they're two sequential steps. And that's, I would say, a question for interpretation. So we'll talk a little bit here about the negotiation of the NPT itself. And here's where you're going to see my sort of own personal interest coming through. Jean alluded in his kind introduction to my dissertation work that I'm doing, where I'm looking in part at, forgive a little dalliance here into my own academic interest, I'm sort of looking at the extent to which, for example, close calls like the Cuban Missile Crisis spurred the United States and the Soviet Union to start engaging in non-proliferation cooperation and arms control work. And so this period of time for me in my own dissertation research is really interesting, because it helps us understand whether there is a causal relationship between these two things. And I wonder what you think about that. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. But before we get to sort of too much in the weeds, I want to note here that, I'm really focusing on, in this particular slide, on the negotiating history between about 1961 and 1968 of the NPT, but there is a very long history dating really back to the immediate, sort of end of the World War II period, efforts to try to conclude some sort of a non-proliferation treaty, or to develop some kind of a mechanism to prevent other states from acquiring nuclear weapons. And so, in fact, you have the UN Atomic Energy Commission is established in 1946, which is very early. That's a period of time in which the United States is the only country that has nuclear weapons, but we know that the Soviet Union was also developing nuclear weapons during that period of time. And they really weren't able to come to any sort of agreement about the best mechanism to prevent other states from developing nuclear weapons. They didn't use the terminology non-proliferation at the time. They called that diffusion, but there was a lot of discussion about how can we do that? Does the United States need to disarm first? Or can we conclude a treaty at the outset that will prevent other countries from getting nuclear weapons? How would that exactly work? And it was really hard to make progress on this issue. And there wasn't a lot of progress for many decades, but starting in the 1960s, you start to see a kind of, or I guess late 1950s, you start to see a real resurgence of interest in this question. And probably one of the first sort of concrete steps down this path is a 1961 resolution that just calls for a non-proliferation treaty. So that sort of, I think, is emblematic of the resurgence of interest in this question in the early 1960s. You see this, for us who look at sort of the history of American politics, you also start to see, in line with this, interest and concern in the Kennedy administration about the potential for other states to develop nuclear weapons. Some of you might be familiar with this kind of canonical Kennedy quote where he said, in 1960, that by the end of his first term in office, he was worried that there could be as many as 20 or 25 states that possess nuclear weapons. Now, that didn't turn out to be true, and we also saw the conclusion of the NPT during this period, so we can have a conversation about whether we think there is a causal relationship between those two things. But this was definitely part of the kind of, I would say, zeitgeist and anxiety of the early 1960s, this concern that other states would start to develop nuclear weapons. You don't see a lot of work on this issue for about 5 years. So between 1961 and 1966, there's discussion about how to do this, but there isn't really a lot of concrete progress that we can point to. And we'll have a conversation about some of the reasons why that could be. But starting in 1966, you start to have very close US and Soviet cooperation on this issue. So they're early on pretty easily able to agree on what they call the sort of no transfer, no receipt language. That's the language that now appears in Articles 1 and 2 of the NPT that we talked about before. States parties or non-nuclear weapon states saying we're not going to get nuclear weapons, states parties that have nuclear weapons saying we're not going to transfer them. But what turns out to be a little bit more difficult is actually the safeguards provision of the treaty. And part of the reason why that's the case is that the IAEA precedes, in terms of the sort of timeline that we're looking at here, the conclusion and negotiation and conclusion of the NPT. So you actually have the IAEA in existence prior to the NPT's conclusion. And you also have Euratom, which is the European sort of version of the IAEA for European states, in existence prior to the NPT. And part of the challenge is that some of the states parties who the United States and the Soviet Union hoped would join the NPT had actually already concluded safeguards agreements with Euratom. And so it was very difficult for the United States and the Soviet Union to figure out, if they wanted IAEA safeguards to be the kind of gold standard safeguards provisions that were enshrined in the treaty, what do we do about countries that have already concluded these regional safeguards agreements with Euratom? How do we fold them into this NPT mechanism and framework? And so there was a lot of discussion between the United States and the Soviet Union about how to do this. Their positions didn't really line up. This had to do with sort of alliance relationships between the United States and Europe and other related, geopolitical challenges. But interestingly enough, and I think this is an important lesson for those of us who are kind of interested in the future of US and Russian cooperation on these issues, you had two very committed, but two in particular really committed American and Soviet negotiators who were working on this particular issue. On the American side, you had a person named George Bunn, who was worked for the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in the United States. And on the Russian side or Soviet side, you had somebody named Ambassador Roland Timurbayev, who was a really famous Soviet negotiator who was also serving on the negotiating team at the NPT. And the two of them were friends, and they decided, I'm sure you can all relate to this. They were in the middle of these intense negotiations. They had a weekend off. They said, let's just go hiking. Let's go hiking around Lake Geneva. And so they went up into the mountains. And because they had been given sort of ad referendum, they were allowed to negotiate ad referendum, they came up with some language that would actually accommodate these two different positions with respect to what we do about states that already have these Euratom safeguards without undercutting what we think should be the gold standard of the NPT's safeguards provisions, which are IAEA safeguards. And so they were able to come up with the language that we now actually see appearing in the treaty. But interestingly enough, both Bun and Timurbayev recognized that they couldn't just, they didn't want this language to be sort of meddled with in their own respective capitals. And so they got the heads of their delegations to do some interesting sort of things to make sure that that didn't happen. So for example, you have the head of the American delegation agreeing to send the language that George Bun and Roland Timurbayev agreed upon back to Washington with a note that said, this is the language that the Soviet Union has come up with as a compromise. And I think this is as far as they're going to be able to go. So I don't think we should try to change any of this language. I think this is kind of take it or leave it. And then you had the head of the Soviet delegation doing exactly the same thing, sending this back to Moscow saying, this is the language that the Americans have come up with, and I don't think they're really going to budge. So I think we better just let this one go and accept that this is the way that it's going to be. But of course, these were exactly the same texts. And so they were just using these strategies to try to get some support from their home capitals for this language that they had been able to come up with. And I dwell upon this, this particular episode because I think it's a really good illustration of the ways that individuals can have a major impact. Institutional advocates can have an impact on the outcome of these negotiations, even though it seems like they must be so constrained by their national positions. And so for somebody like myself, who's interested in understanding what will it take to get US and Russian relations in this area back on track, that's something I think about a lot. And it's kind of a motivating factor for a lot of the work that we do in terms of nurturing a next generation of experts who work together and trust one another. So once that happens, things are pretty much on a good track and happen very quickly. So, between August of 1967 and May of 1968, you basically see the finalization of the text of the NPT itself. And then finally, in July of 1968, the NPT opens for signature. So you'll notice here that, as I mentioned before, there's this long break between 1961 and 1966 where we don't actually see a lot of progress on the NPT. And I have a couple of ideas for why I think this is the case, but I'd be curious to hear what you think too. So one of them is this one that I alluded to previously, the Cuban Missile Crisis. There is a lot of scholarship in our field that suggests that it took the United States and the Soviet Union coming to the brink of war to understand, hey, maybe we need to sit down at the negotiating table with each other and really start to get serious about doing something about the arms race. And so in a lot of scholarship, even though the NPT itself was actually concluded under a subsequent US administration following the Kennedy assassination, there's still this idea that it took something really scary, a scary event like this to drive both parties to get serious and step to the negotiating table. You also then see, not unrelated, the negotiation of a lot of arms control agreements happening during the same period of time. And I think that there's some merit to the idea that cooperation begets cooperation. So before, the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union didn't really have a lot of experience negotiating with one another. They didn't really have a lot of practice doing that. They didn't have good models to draw from. But starting after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963 with the Limited Test Stand Treaty, but also continuing with the Outer Space Treaty, the Hotline Agreement, all kinds of things like that, you have a more experienced group of negotiators who better understand how to deal with one another in this space. And so I think that it's worth considering how these other agreements that don't necessarily seem directly related to the NPT might have created an environment where this type of cooperation is possible. You also have, looking at this from kind of a realist IR perspective, you also have China developing nuclear capability. So it's worth thinking, I think, about how external threats can drive adversaries to cooperate on some of these really sensitive issues. China testing was a surprise for both the United States and the Soviet Union. And I think it's worth thinking about, how that might have changed the perceived utility of a non-proliferation agreement in ways that helped move beyond some of these impasses. You also see, and this is a really important one, the US abandoning its multilateral nuclear force idea. And this was basically the idea that you would have, ships that were, nuclear capable, essentially. So they would have Polaris missiles with nuclear warheads on them, sailing around international waters, manned by an international team of NATO staff, to extend the US deterrent. And this was an idea that the Soviet Union really didn't like, unsurprisingly. And so there kind of wasn't a lot of progress on the negotiation of the NPT itself until the United States agreed to abandon this idea for a multilateral nuclear force. And so I think the important lesson for those of us who are looking at the future today is that, successful non-proliferation cooperation between adversaries requires flexibility, and it requires a degree of sort of a willingness to see the bigger good, or the bigger objective. And sometimes that changes your own calculus about your security interests and what will best serve them. So that was an important, inflection point, I would say, in the negotiation of the NPT, is the United States moving away from this interest in a multilateral nuclear force. And that really ushered in a moment when the United States and the Soviet Union could actually cooperate effectively on this issue. And then, not unrelated to the previous point that I made about the limited test ban treaty, you also just have, the United States and the Soviet Union, I think, developing a better sensibility for what one another's perceived threats are, in part because they started to cooperate in other kind of institutional areas. So starting in 1962, you have the United States and the Soviet Union convening their first meeting as co-chairs of this 18-nation disarmament committee, where the NPT negotiations are really, in large part, happening. So you have these two, again, kind of institutional advocates at the top, learning and better understanding and developing a security sensibility for what one another's perceived threats are, how to work together. I think that that also helped to drive this cooperation. So I want to spend a little bit of time, because I know we're getting close to the end here, talking about just some key moments in the NPT review process. So the NPT, as some of you probably know, I'm guessing some of you have attended these meetings, is reviewed in 5-year increments. So every 5 years, you have a big review of the treaty where states parties come together to look at how has the treaty been applied? Do we think it has been applied successfully? What are some mechanisms in the future and some measures in the future that we think would enhance the implementation of the NPT? What can we do to make sure that it's being implemented effectively? But then leading up to those 5-year reviews, at least in the present moment, we have these 3 preparatory committee meetings. So starting in, the states parties give themselves a break the year after a review conference has happened, so they don't meet, although we'll see something different happen this year probably. But in the 3 years leading up to the review process, they do come together and meet for about 2 weeks in either New York, Geneva, or Vienna. And part of what they do during those interim meetings is, first they just kind of take the pulse, get a sense for what issues are going to potentially be challenging at the big NPT review conference meetings. But at least with respect to the meeting that happens immediately prior to the review conference, part of the goal is to try to arrive at some consensus recommendations that could then be forwarded on to the review conference. Now, Jean can probably tell us more of that history, but that has not, to my knowledge, ever actually happened and worked in the way that it was supposed to, but that's the aspiration, is that you're supposed to try to be able to develop some consensus recommendations that can then be forwarded on to the review conference itself. So the last NPT meeting that we have had before the pandemic was this 3rd preparatory committee meeting that is supposed to precede the 2020 NPT review conference. But of course, that has all been thrown off as a result of the pandemic. So I think in our next session, we'll talk a little bit about what that means for the review process. But in general, if we're kind of looking at what is a metric of success for these review conference meetings, and we can debate whether you think this is actually a good measuring stick for what success should be. What states parties are trying to do is to negotiate a consensus final document. So they want to agree, across all of these diverse states parties on how they assess the implementation of the treaty and ideally what will come after that. And that's really hard because there are a lot of countries that have very, very different perspectives and different perspectives when it comes to the NPT. And they have about a 50% success rate in adopting these consensus final documents. So just some kind of key moments that people often will talk about as watershed NPT review conference outcome documents. In 1995, the treaty was indefinitely extended. So initially, the treaty was only negotiated for a 25-year period of time, but in 1995, states parties agreed without voting, because there isn't really voting in the NPT, to extend it. You see later in the year 2000, the sort of adoption of 13 practical steps that are aimed at furthering the implementation of the NPT. And then in 2010, 10 years after that, you see the adoption of a 64-point action plan that goes even farther than these 13 practical steps in terms of laying out a roadmap for, okay, here is how we're going to implement all of the provisions in the NPT. Here are the different action items that we would like to see states parties take. And because in 2015, there was no consensus document, there's a lot of question around the extent to which this 64-point action plan, which is the last consensus document that we have, is still relevant, should still be the benchmark by which we assess progress towards the implementation of the treaty, or whether that is totally anachronistic and it doesn't really fit the security environment that we live in 2021. And so you'll often hear discussions between practitioners and analysts and scholars about what is the continued relevance of this acquis, this, and in particular, the 64-point action plan as a benchmark for how we're doing and where we should be going. You may hear some of this in the next session too, but people will sometimes point out the fact that the 64-point action plan talks about the importance of the entry into force of the New START treaty. Well, the New START treaty is now in force, so that's clearly not, a goal that countries should be working for. So how do we differentiate between these things that are still applicable today, these things that no longer seem to be that relevant, and how should that sort of align with this idea that nothing should actually supersede the provisions of the treaty itself, and that the treaty is really what is being reviewed at the review process. So there's a lot of discussion about how that should look, and it's become even more complicated the farther we move away from 2010 and the fact that we still have not had this next NPT review conference and we don't have another consensus document to work from. Okay, so I want to be sure to leave some time for questions because I'm really eager to hear from you about what you think, but I just want to highlight a couple of international and NPT developments that I have heard at the NPT, because I've been privileged to go to some of these meetings during the current NPT review cycle. So, and we can talk again a little bit about the extent to which you think these will make things more complicated, make things easier, present unforeseen sort of wildcard challenges. But in terms of international developments, you really see a lot that was kind of happening on the arms control space, on the arms control side of things, particularly prior to the change in administration in the United States. So you saw, the collapse of the INF Treaty, the United States withdrawing from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or the Iran deal. Most recently, the end of the Open Skies Treaty, which was not exactly an arms control treaty, but helped to facilitate this kind of transparency and confidence building between, the United States, Russia, and other countries. So it's worth thinking about what that means for the implementation of Article 6, whether we think Article 6 is those good faith negotiations, are they happening? But then more recently, in sort of better news, you saw the extension of the New START treaty. So we're kind of trying to, I think when states parties do eventually come together for this review conference, I think we'll see a kind of effort to reconcile this track record and how do we understand that and how do we understand it in relation to Article 6. You also see, just sort of in if we're thinking about force modernization and what that looks like on the nuclear weapon state side of things, Russia is developing these new exotic systems. You see modernization happening in a big way in Russia, China, and the United States. You have the American government accusing the Russian and Chinese governments of violating the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and their obligations under that. I suspect we will not see some of those accusations coming from the current administration, but again, that was part of the review cycle that states parties will be looking at. You also definitely see the revival of strategic competition and a sort of interest in exploring potential mechanisms for multilateral arms control. So recognizing that it's not just the United States and Russia, even though they are the biggest nuclear weapon states, but a conversation about how do we fold in these other countries as well. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has presented serious economic and, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, diplomatic challenges in terms of just implementing and doing the work of reviewing the treaty. But just to wind up here, to focus a little bit more on just NPT developments themselves, what this means is that there's a lot of consternation about what feels like slow progress or a lack of progress on the implementation of nuclear disarmament. So, many, particularly non-nuclear weapon states, are concerned about what seems like a slowing down or a backing away from previous commitments when it comes to disarmament. So I think that that's one of the themes that we'll really hear come out the next time states parties come together. You also have, of course, the TPNW and the entry into force of the TPNW. So that's something that has happened during the current NPT review cycle. And one of the things I will really be listening for, and one of the things we'll talk about in our next session, is what that means for the implementation of the NPT, for the review of the NPT. How will states parties talk about that event? And will they be able to agree upon language about how to talk about that event? That could be a real challenge. In relation to all of the international developments that I sort of mentioned up here, you also have really bad atmospherics at the NPT in these most recent meetings. You have a lot of kind of rights of reply, states parties exercising their right of reply to, lob these very vitriolic comments at one another. And that changes the dynamic and the kind of feeling of the NPT meetings. And, Jean can tell us whether that's a new innovation, so to speak, or not, but at least in my relatively, limited 5-year experience with the NPT, it feels like those have become a more frequent occurrence than they were in the past. You also have, disagreements and discussions about how to address the issue of the Middle East WMD free zone in the NPT context. Again, during this past NPT review cycle, you had a meeting of states parties outside of the NPT to talk about ways to advance the conclusion of or the establishment of such a zone. But oftentimes these discussions have become part of the NPT because they relate to decisions and resolutions that were taken in 1995 about the importance of establishing a Middle East WMD free zone. So we'll see whether those things can be effectively delinked, whether there's utility in doing that, and what that means for the review of the NPT itself. And then sort of on the flip side of things, maybe more positive things, I'll be curious to hear what you think about this, but there has been a revival within something called the P5 process, which is the process where states parties who possess nuclear weapons come together to try to discuss ways to advance the implementation of Article 6. They've started to become more active. They're meeting more frequently than they did for several years. And there's been a real interest in focusing on reducing the risk of nuclear use. And I think one of the questions that we'll perhaps hear at the next NPT review conference, whenever that happens, is whether we think that there is some tension between risk reduction, reducing the risk of nuclear weapons being used, and disarmament, because you can imagine that there are some states parties who might believe that reducing the risk of nuclear weapons implies that you intend to possess nuclear weapons indefinitely and you're just trying to make them safe. Whereas I think the nuclear weapon states would argue, no, this is a reflection of the current security environment, the current risk of escalation, and we should take any steps possible to make sure that these weapons are, while they exist, being used, or that they're safe, that they're secure, and they're not going to lead to nuclear war. So there's kind of a tension there. And then you also have, for me, a big question is what will happen with this relatively new US initiative called Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament. So this was kind of an innovation of the previous US administration. It was really centered around this idea that it's going to be hard to make progress on disarmament unless the security environment is conducive to that type of work. And so let's figure out what the challenges in this bigger security environment are to nuclear disarmament, and then work on making progress to resolve some of those issues. And I don't yet know, because we haven't seen the Biden administration's nuclear posture review, whether that will continue to be part of US policy or whether that will not. And so that's something I'm definitely going to be listening out for when we hopefully come together and get to hear what states parties think sometime next year. So I think that that's the last thing I want to say, except to mention something that will be important for our next conversation and something that I began our discussion with here today, which is that one of the really positive, I think, evolutions that I have seen in the last 5 years or so within the NPT is a much more nuanced and I would say sophisticated discussion of why diversity matters in our field. So there's been a lot of research in the United States, particularly in the private sector, that talks about, what gender diversity, for example, what it means to have more women in an organization or all genders engaged in an organization, what that actually means in terms of outcomes. And we now have some really solid research that suggests that, guess what? It actually is really beneficial to have people who have different ideas and come from different backgrounds working on these really difficult issues, and that can lead to better outcomes. It's not just about what is fair. Of course, that's important. What is equitable, that's important too. But in terms of working on the types of tough issues that we all work on, it matters to have a lot of different people with different perspectives so that you can eventually arrive at the best possible solution about how to proceed. And so I have seen, I think in my own personal opinion, a sort of evolution of this conversation away from just, we should be striving for 50-50 parity at the NPT meetings. That's great and true, but an evolution to a discussion about what that actually means and how that would manifest and what that would mean for outcomes is something that I have been very encouraged to see in our space. So I'm going to stop here, and I'd love to hear any questions from you. This was a lot of material in a very short amount of time, so I'd welcome anything you have to say. And Jean, maybe I'll ask you to help me here with the fielding of questions, but you're welcome to put things in the chat, or you can raise hands. I see a couple of hands up already. So perhaps I can begin with calling on Ricardo, and then Israel, I see you also. So maybe Ricardo first, and then Israel.
Thank you, Professor Bidgood. It was a very insightful presentation, and very comprehensive as well. I have a question, particularly relating to the last points you made, especially when it comes to the JCPOA. Do you think that the JCPOA could actually bolster trust between state parties? Because this is also an example for other nuclear powers that could foresee sanctions like the DPRK. So you think that the trust building regarding the JCPOA could actually bolster or could be bolstered by this meeting that President Putin and President Biden had, and with the panorama for future START actually being over the horizon? Could this be like, on either way, a thing that could actually bolster each other or complement each other in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Ricardo. Thank you for asking that. I mean, you're right. So we're talking about one kind of mechanism in this bigger regime of measures and instruments that are all aimed at mutually reinforcing goals. So preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, but then also reducing vertical proliferation in states that already possess them. So I think you're right on the money. I mean, if you make progress in one area, as we often say, cooperation begets cooperation. So, I think it will be really significant if, the United States and the Russian Federation are able to begin these strategic stability talks, have them work productively. That can be an indication to states parties in the NPT context that, hey, they're starting to make progress towards fulfilling their obligations under Article 6. That's a good thing. So that could really change the tenor of the conversation when states parties come together. Same with the JCPOA. As I alluded to in our last slide here, one of the big challenges is how to make progress on a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. Figuring out what's going to happen to Iran and with Iran's nuclear program is a really crucial part of that puzzle, as you're getting at. So I think you're absolutely right that there are these evolving pieces that kind of orbit around the NPT. And even though we sometimes hear that the NPT doesn't always reflect the most pressing or most salient international security issues, that there's sometimes this surreal quality to the NPT where they don't always deal with the issues that are the most pressing, you're absolutely right that this can shape the atmosphere and it can feed into this conversation in these really important ways. So we'll have to keep our ear to the ground and see what that looks like. Yeah, thanks for that question. Israel, if you're on the line, I see you have a question in the chat maybe. And if not, we can go to Lloyd, who also looked like he had a question. Okay, so Lloyd, do you want to, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question in case people aren't looking at the chat. Okay, I'll read it out. So Lloyd's asking, what gives certain countries the right to have nuclear weapons and discourage others from having them? If all these countries had sovereign states or are sovereign states, shouldn't they be free to pursue testing? I refer to the US and the USSR. It's a good question. I mean, I think that there is often a perception, and there was particularly a perception during the period of time in which the NPT was being negotiated, that, there was this kind of hegemony that the United States in particular, in the very early days of negotiating the NPT, was the country that possessed nuclear weapons, and what right did they have to tell other countries what to do? But the bottom line is, if you have signed up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, that is a legally binding agreement. And so you are obligated to fulfill the terms of that agreement if you're a non-nuclear weapon state. So it's not really so much about the rights of the United States and the Soviet Union, or the rights of the United States and the Russian Federation. It's really about legal obligations. And if you are a state party to the NPT, that is an obligation that you have taken upon yourself. And I notice here you ask about testing too. Same thing with the CTBT, or in the case of the United States and the Soviet Union, the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Those are legally binding obligations. So I hope I answered your question there. Jimena, it looks like you have your hand up. If you want to go ahead.
Hello, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really, really clear. Also, it's a really difficult topic for me, for example, that I have no previous knowledge about the topic. I wanted to know, what was the role of the scientist in the negotiation before the first treaty? In the 1962, you told us it started the negotiation the first time of when it started the negotiation. How was the role of them?
Of scientists? That's such a great question. Yeah, it's so I confess I don't know as much about the role of scientists in the NPT negotiations themselves, although Jean might be able to tell us that. But I can tell you in general, in the area that I tend to focus on US-Soviet relations, scientists played an absolutely essential role, particularly in sustaining cooperation at some of these difficult political moments. So sometimes, it would be really hard for the United States and the Soviet Union to negotiate a treaty because the political environment just wasn't conducive. But you would have scientists who were interested in pursuing and exploring different verification mechanisms, and they would be able to sort of come together in these ways that weren't kind of apolitical to work towards cooperating on developing these different mechanisms. So here I'm thinking, you mentioned 1962, I'm actually jumping ahead thinking about the 1980s. So you had these test ban treaties between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Threshold Test Ban Treaty and the Peaceful Nuclear Explosions Treaty, that had been negotiated in the 70s, but neither side was really confident that they could verify those agreements. And so even at these really difficult moments between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Reagan administration in the US, you still had scientists working together to develop these mechanisms to verify these treaties that actually enabled them to be ratified in the 1980s. And so you have scientists playing this really important role in terms of determining how a treaty is verifiable, but then also doing this cooperative work that I think allows engagement to be sustained between these two adversarial states at moments when political cooperation isn't necessarily possible. So if you want to ever chat about that, I can go on and on and on about it. So please let me know, and feel free to email me, and I can send you some material that you might find interesting if that's a topic that's of interest to you. But thanks for that question, Jimena.
Sarah, if I could just weigh in there,
Sure, John.
very briefly. I mean, what is notable when you look at the delegations in all these meetings, especially the NPT, but also meetings of the BWC, you will find, especially the Russians and the American delegations are notorious for this. They have a very large group of people, mostly gray-headed old men, sitting behind the lead negotiator. Many of them are scientists. And when it comes to the NPT, when you talk about obligations and so on, then these are the people that are weighing in, maybe not directly on the floor, but they are always in the background. So this is a field where science and diplomacy intersect very, very closely. Diplomats don't enter into agreement until they have consulted with the scientists or the military, or the combination of both. But it's a very good question.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's exactly right. Great point. So let's see. I'm going to tell you who's on my list, because I think we're supposed to wind up at 8:30 our time, right, Sean? Ish? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. So I have first Enrique, and then I'm going to ask Lisa and Jose to speak. So Enrique, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Professor Bidgood, for such a rich presentation. So I have two questions. One is very broad and one is rather specific. So considering everything that has been discussed and the fact that reaching a complete disarmament of nuclear weapons is unlikely, from your point of view, is the treaty achieving what was original ambition, or is it falling short? And my second question, which is very specific, what are the main disagreements during the negotiations on a weapons mass destruction free zone in the Middle East? And what should be the role of other nuclear free zones, such as Tlatelolco in Latin America?
Oh, that's good. Those are both really good questions. So, gosh, the first one is it's a tough nut to crack. And I think there are a lot of different perspectives on this, and hopefully we'll get some of those during our panel discussion, which will come next. But I mean, in my own personal opinion, if you're looking at kind of the timeline, you're looking at the potential for states to proliferate in terms of their technology, and then you're looking at what has actually happened. Yeah, it seems to me like the NPT has achieved its objective. It's a non-proliferation treaty. You have a lot of states that could have potentially developed a nuclear weapons capability and didn't. I don't think we can identify one independent variable as the NPT as the thing that meant that states didn't develop a nuclear weapons capability, but it definitely contributed from a normative standpoint, from a legal standpoint, and just from a sort of institutional standpoint to making sure that that didn't happen. So yeah, I think on balance, it's doing its job. That doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement, 100%, but I do think it's been effective in its stated goals. In terms of your second question, I mean, I think the biggest challenge is the fact that in the Middle East, you have a nuclear weapons possessing country of Israel. And so that's something that is really challenging to negotiate, is this relationship, this security relationship between Iran and Israel. And the fact that, Israel is not a party to the NPT makes it challenging to then have these conversations about what the establishment of a WMD free zone in the Middle East should look like in the NPT context, which is, I think, part of the rationale for moving the conversations about establishing this WMD free zone out of the NPT and into the UN General Assembly setting, which is what has happened in the last 2 years, I guess. But it is definitely, it's just a very sticky issue, and you're, constantly sort of having to deal with this chicken or egg discussion. Does there need to be peace in the Middle East before a zone can be negotiated? If a zone were negotiated, would that help bring about peace in the Middle East? And those are just, as you know, huge, perennial, thorny conversations that can't necessarily be resolved by a non-proliferation treaty meeting that's supposed to happen over 4 weeks every 5 years. So it's really difficult, but I do think that there's a lot of, there are lessons to be learned from other zones. And I think, there's a big literature and a big focus in the academic space and the practitioner space on exactly that question. What can we draw from the negotiation of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, for example, that we can then apply to the Middle East WMD free zone process? But of course, those are two very different security environments. But that's a great question, and I'm glad you're thinking about that. Thank you, Enrique. Lisa, how about you?
Hiya. Well, I would first like to thank you for your very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering, a very easier question, if you have concluded on a decision or resolution in the gender equality in the decision-making process, and if so, how did the process go?
So sort of, I want to make sure I understand your question. Just insight into kind of how the discussion around gender equality has taken place in the NPT and what that looks like, or is that your question?
Yeah, more than if you have concluded on a resolution that
a resolution
talks about the gender equality. Yes.
And whether there is one or what that would look like. Yeah.
Yes.
So there hasn't been one. There has been language in some of the recent, I would say, NPT outcome documents from the current review cycle that do talk about things like, we need to recognize that if there were to be the use of nuclear weapons, it would disproportionately impact women and girls in different ways than it would men, just because of biology. But there hasn't really been any kind of a, statement that's a consensus document beyond those about the importance of gender equality or equity in the NPT setting. Oftentimes you'll have states parties who on their own initiative or with maybe a small group of states will make a statement that includes something about the importance of diversity and equity, or the importance about kind of bringing, a feminist gaze to some of these issues, or a feminist foreign policy to some of these issues. But that has not been embraced yet on this big scale among all of the states parties. So that is definitely something that I will be listening out for when, if I get to go to the review conference in whenever, 2022, whenever it happens, I'll be curious to hear how what seems to me like a change in the discourse and an evolution of the discourse might actually be captured in a final document, or if that's the kind of thing that is just not going to make it in there because it doesn't yet seem important enough to states parties to include there. So we'll have to listen out, Lisa, but it's a good question. Thanks. Jose, I think you're last but not least.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. I'm sorry I was not able to exactly listen the whole time of your presentation. I have had some problems with my connection. However, I first of all wanted to thank you for that. I wanted to make a very brief question, being the first. How do you see the conflict between the NPT and the TPNW? The second, and if there is one, the second would be when one reads the 2016 outcome of the NPT review conference, it seems to me like the problems or the challenges from today are not exactly being tackled by the settings of the treaty. It seems to me also that we do live in a different reality and the one that it was written back in the 60s. So maybe there is a debate on whether we have already a treaty that is not adapted for this. And then my last question would be, what do you think that we should expect? Hello?
Oh, can you hear us, Jose?
Can you still hear me? Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can't see you anymore, but we can hear you.
Fair enough. Something happened. I apologize.
Sure.
My first question would be, what do you think we shall expect from this review conference that we're going to have probably between January and February next year? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. Those are great questions. So I'm actually going to leave the last one for our next conversation, because I think that's going to be kind of a theme that we're going to focus around, is what can we expect. So I'm going to punt that to my wiser colleagues who will be speaking. But But in terms of, your second question in particular, this one about, is the NPT fit for purpose? That's often a phrase that you'll hear people say. Is the NPT really up to the challenges that we're facing today? And does the treaty text reflect the condition in which it was negotiated or the state of affairs today? And, sadly, I think different people would have answered this question differently at various moments. So maybe in 2010, when you're sort of riding high on the Obama administration's Prague speech, where he was really talking about the importance of nuclear disarmament, making progress there, you might have said, I don't know what the NPT does the NPT have a role to play here? I'm not sure, because it seems like states parties are taking their own initiative and really making progress here. During the Trump administration, I would have said, yeah, I think the NPT does play a really important role there, because it is sustaining the discussion around the importance of disarmament when that's not actually happening on an official government to government level. So there is, to me, what that drives home is that, particularly for those of us who live in a democracy where you will see a change in government and change in administration, the NPT and the multilateral regime are part of what sustain the discussion and sustain momentum for and sustain engagement about the importance of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, when different administrations who come into office might have different perspectives on the ways that those priorities should play out. So there's this sustaining role that the NPT plays that I think is very fit for purpose. It's reflective of the ups and downs in our political cycles, and helps to kind of even those out. So from that standpoint, if you're looking at it from almost a bureaucratic, political, or institutional or organizational standpoint, I think the NPT continues to be exceptionally relevant and something that is really important. But thanks for those questions. Sean, we have Uriel who has his hand up, and I think he may be the last one, so I know we're over. But Uriel, do you want to go ahead and ask?
Yes, thank you. It's just a quick comment and recommendation on this topic regarding the benefits of having gender equality in the negotiations. I just read this article on why women make great diplomats. It's focused on the role of Rose Goldmoller, who was the first woman to lead a major nuclear negotiation, and the publication of her book, which is Negotiating the New START Treaty. So I will share this article with the rest of the cohort, but just was a recommendation.
Thank you so much, Uriel. Yes, Rose is an inspiration, I think, to all of us, and particularly, American women who are working in this space. So I really hope you do share that link. That would be great. And as you pointed out, Rose's book has just come out. So I'm sure there's a lot to glean there about exactly what the role of gender and individuals are in these negotiations, and why that matters and why those relationships matter. So thank you for highlighting that. Jean, I believe that is it. So I'm going to hand the floor back over to you, but I want to say thank you to everyone on the line for your great questions. And I think we'll see each other again in about 20 minutes. So very soon. But Jean, over to you.